Smoke filled the hallway before Sophia even understood what was happening. She woke to a sound like paper tearing, except it was louder, and it did not stop. Her eyes opened to a ceiling glowing orange at the edges, and for a moment, she thought she was still dreaming. Then the heat reached her skin, and she knew this was real. She pushed herself up in bed, one hand instantly moving to her stomach, protecting the child growing inside her. 8 months along, and every motion now took effort, but fear gave her a strength she did not know she had. She swung her legs off the bed and stood, swaying as smoke curled beneath the door like something alive, searching for a way in. "Daniel," she called out, her voice cracking. "Daniel." No answer came from the other side of the house. She told herself he was already outside, already calling for help, already thinking of her. She had no reason yet to doubt him. Not in this moment. Not when survival was the only thing that mattered. The bedroom door was warm when she touched it, not yet dangerous, and she opened it slowly, the way she had been taught in some safety class years ago, a class she never imagined she would actually need. Smoke rushed in immediately, thick and gray, stinging her eyes, filling her throat. She dropped low, remembering that clean air lived closer to the floor, and began to crawl. Every second stretched impossibly long. She could hear the fire now, not just smell it. A low roaring sound coming from somewhere below. Maybe the kitchen, maybe the study. Popping noises followed, sharp and sudden, like the house itself was breaking apart piece by piece. She kept moving, her knees scraping against the hardwood floor, her lungs burning with the effort of holding her breath as long as she could. Somewhere in the smoke, a shape passed by. A man's silhouette, tall, moving fast, carrying something in his arms. For half a heartbeat, hope surged through her. Daniel had come for her, but he did not stop. He did not even turn his head toward the sound of her voice, as she called his name again. He moved past the top of the staircase and disappeared down through the smoke, and in his arms, Sophia caught the shape of a woman, dark hair spilling over his shoulder, bare feet dangling limp. Sophia's mind refused to accept what her eyes had shown her. She told herself it was a trick of the smoke, a shadow, anything but what it looked like. There was no time to think further. The heat behind her was growing, and the popping sounds were turning into something closer to explosions. She had to move. She reached the top of the stairs and looked down into a wall of gray and orange. The front door stood open at the bottom, smoke pouring through it into the night, but the stairs themselves were becoming impossible to see through. She gripped the railing, testing her balance, and began her slow descent, one hand cradling her belly, the other white-knuckled against the wood. Halfway down, her foot slipped. She caught herself before falling completely, but the jolt sent a sharp pain through her lower back, and for one terrifying second, she thought something might be wrong with the baby. She forced herself to keep moving, step by step, breathing through gritted teeth, refusing to let fear stop her legs from working. A voice called out from outside, rough with worry. "Is anyone still in there? Sophia?" It was Walter, their neighbor from the property next door, an older man, who had lived beside them for over a decade. He appeared at the doorway with a wet cloth pressed to his own face, and when he saw her on the stairs, he did not hesitate. He ran in without a second thought for his own safety, closing the distance quickly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders to steady her weight. "I've got you," he said. "Just keep walking, we're almost there." Together they made it down the last few steps and out through the front door, into air that felt shockingly cold and clean after the poison she had been breathing. Sophia collapsed onto the front lawn, coughing violently, her whole body shaking. Walter knelt beside her, checking her over, asking if she could feel the baby moving, asking if anything hurt beyond the coughing. It was only then, gasping against the grass, that she looked up and saw him. Daniel stood near the driveway, a good distance from the burning house, his shirt torn slightly at the collar. Beside him stood a woman Sophia recognized immediately, though recognition brought no comfort, only a sick twisting in her stomach. Claire, a woman from Daniel's office, someone Sophia had met perhaps 3 times at company events, always polished, always smiling in that careful way people smile when they are hiding something. Claire was wrapped in a blanket that was not hers, sitting on the low stone wall at the edge of the driveway, looking shaken but very much alive. Daniel stood over her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his focus entirely on her face, checking to see if she was hurt. He had not looked toward the house once since Sophia had come outside. It took several more seconds before Daniel's eyes finally found his wife on the grass, surrounded by neighbors who had begun to gather, sirens now wailing in the distance as fire trucks approached. Something flickered across his face when he saw her, something Sophia would later try to name and never quite manage. Not relief, not joy that she was safe, something closer to surprise, as though he had genuinely not expected to see her there. "Sophia," he said, finally walking toward her, though his steps were slow, almost reluctant. "Thank God you're okay." She stared at him, unable to form words. The smoke still burned in her throat, but it was not smoke that kept her silent now. It was the image burned into her mind, the sight of him carrying another woman through the fire, while his wife and unborn child were left behind on the floor above. "You left me," she finally managed to say, her voice hoarse and small. Daniel's face shifted into something defensive, something practiced. "I panicked. I didn't think clearly. Claire was closer to me. She was right there. I just reacted." "You carried her out first," Sophia said, cutting him off. "You didn't even look for me." "That's not fair," Daniel said, glancing nervously toward the gathering crowd of neighbors, aware suddenly of how this looked, how this sounded. "I would never leave you on purpose. You know that." Sophia did not know that. Not anymore. The paramedics arrived moments later, moving quickly to check on her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, asking questions about the baby, about how long she had been in the smoke, whether she had lost consciousness at any point. She answered as best she could, her mind only half present, the other half replaying that silhouette on the stairs over and over, the woman's dark hair, the bare feet, the way Daniel had not even glanced toward his wife's voice calling his name. As the paramedics helped her into the ambulance for observation, she caught sight of Claire again, still wrapped in that blanket, watching the scene with an expression that was difficult to read, not quite guilt, not quite triumph. Something in between, something calculating, as if she were already trying to understand what this night would mean for her. Daniel tried to climb into the ambulance beside Sophia, but one of the paramedics gently stopped him, explaining that only one person could ride along, and that Sophia needed to remain calm for the baby's sake. Daniel stood outside the doors, watching as they closed, his expression unreadable in the flashing lights. The ride to the hospital passed in a blur. Sophia stared at the ceiling of the ambulance, one hand still resting on her belly, feeling the baby shift and kick, as though sensing her distress. The paramedic beside her spoke gently, reassuring her that everything looked stable, that they would run tests as soon as they arrived, that the important thing now was to breathe slowly and stay calm. Calm felt impossible. Her thoughts kept circling back to small details she had never questioned before. The late nights at the office, that had become more frequent over the past year. The phone that Daniel now kept face down on the nightstand, a habit that started sometime after his last promotion. The trip to the coast 4 months ago that he claimed was purely for work. A trip Sophia had been too pregnant and too tired to join, though she remembered feeling a strange loneliness when he described it afterward, details slightly too vague for a man who usually loved recounting every moment of his travels. She had dismissed all of it. She had trusted him. At the hospital, doctors confirmed that both Sophia and the baby were stable, though they wanted to keep her overnight for observation given the smoke exposure and the stress on her body. She lay in the hospital bed, an oxygen mask resting lightly over her nose and mouth, staring at the white ceiling tiles, trying to make sense of what her life had become in the span of a single hour. Daniel arrived at the hospital nearly 40 minutes after her, having stayed behind, he claimed, to speak with the fire department and to make sure Claire got home safely. He walked into the room carrying a coffee he had bought from the vending machine, setting it down on the table beside her bed, as though this small gesture might repair something between them. "How are you feeling?" he asked, pulling a chair closer. Sophia turned her head away from him, staring instead at the window, at the dark parking lot outside, where a few cars sat beneath orange streetlights. "You made sure she got home safely," she repeated, her voice flat. "Before you came here, to me." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit she recognized instantly, one he only did when he knew he was in trouble. It's not what it looked like. What did it look like, Daniel? He did not answer right away, and in that silence, Sophia felt something inside her go quiet and cold, a kind of clarity settling over the panic and confusion of the last few hours. She had been married to this man for 6 years. She had built a life with him, planned a family with him, trusted him with every part of herself. And in the one moment that mattered most, the moment when the house was burning, and her life and their child's life hung in the balance, he had chosen someone else first. "I want to know who she is to you," Sophia said quietly, her eyes finally meeting his. "The truth, not the story you told the neighbors." Daniel's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, and that silence told Sophia everything the words never could. Outside the hospital window, the first gray light of morning began to creep over the horizon, and somewhere across the city, the wreckage of the house they had shared was still smoldering, the fire finally under control, but the damage already done, in ways no fire department could ever repair. Sophia closed her eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline that had carried her through the night. But even as sleep pulled at her, one thought remained sharp and clear in her mind, a thought that would guide everything she did in the days to come. She would find out exactly what her husband had been hiding, and she would never again be the woman left behind on the stairs while someone else was carried to safety first. The nurse came in twice during the early hours to check her vitals, and each time, Sophia pretended to be asleep, unwilling to speak, unwilling to look at Daniel sitting in the chair beside her bed, his phone glowing faintly in the dark as he typed message after message to someone, his thumb moving quickly across the screen. She did not need to ask who he was writing to. She already knew. By the time real morning arrived, streaming pale light through the blinds, Sophia had made a decision. She would not scream. She would not cry in front of him again. She would gather herself, protect her child, and find out exactly how deep this betrayal went, no matter how long it took, or how much it would hurt to learn the truth. The fire had taken her home. She would not let it take her future as well. When the doctor came in for the morning rounds, checking the baby's heartbeat on the monitor, listening to the steady rhythm fill the room, Sophia watched the screen with tears finally slipping down her cheeks, tears she had held back all night. Not tears of fear this time, but something else entirely, a fierce and quiet determination taking root beneath the grief. Her daughter's heartbeat was strong. That was enough for now. That was the only thing that mattered in this moment. Everything else, she would deal with one careful step at a time. Daniel reached for her hand as the doctor spoke, and for the first time since the fire began, Sophia did not pull away immediately. She let his fingers rest against hers, cold and unfamiliar now, while her mind worked quietly behind a calm expression, already beginning to plan, already beginning to understand that the life she thought she had was gone, burned away as completely as the house on the hill, and that whatever came next would require a strength she had never needed to find before. She looked at him, at the man she had once loved without question, and felt something inside her shift permanently, a door, closing quietly but completely. The fire outside was finally out. The fire inside her had only just begun. The hospital discharged Sophia 2 days later, her lungs clear, her daughter's heartbeat steady on every monitor they attached to her swollen belly. She should have felt relief walking out through those sliding glass doors, but instead, she felt only a strange numbness, as though she were watching her own life happen to someone else from a great distance. Elias was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his car with his arms crossed, his jaw set in a way that told her he had already heard everything. Sophia's older brother had never liked Daniel, not truly, though he had kept his opinions mostly to himself for her sake over the years. That restraint appeared to be gone now. "You're not going back to a hotel with him," Elias said before she had even reached the car. "You're coming to my place, no arguments." Sophia did not argue. She did not have the strength left for it, and some quiet part of her recognized that her brother was right. Daniel had rented a suite downtown while insurance adjusters assessed the damage to the house, and the thought of sharing a hotel room with him now, of lying beside him in a bed after what she had seen, made her stomach turn. The drive to Elias's apartment passed in silence, broken only by the hum of the road and the occasional buzz of Sophia's phone, which she had turned face down in her lap and refused to check. She knew who it was. Daniel had been calling since the moment she left the hospital wing, leaving voicemail after voicemail, his tone shifting from apologetic to pleading to, by the fifth message, faintly irritated that she was not answering. Elias's apartment was modest but comfortable, and he had already prepared the guest room for her, complete with a small bassinet he had borrowed from a coworker, an unexpectedly thoughtful gesture that brought sudden tears to Sophia's eyes when she saw it. "I don't know how long I'll need to stay," she said quietly, standing in the doorway of the room. "Stay as long as you need," Elias said. "Longer than that if you want." That evening, after a dinner neither of them finished, Elias sat across from her at the small kitchen table and finally asked the question she had been dreading. "Tell me exactly what happened. Everything. Don't leave anything out because you think it'll upset me," Sophia told him. She described waking to the smoke, crawling through the hallway, the shape of Daniel moving past her toward the stairs with Claire in his arms, the way he had not stopped, had not even called out to check if she was safe. She described standing on the lawn afterward, watching him fuss over Claire while paramedics tended to his pregnant wife a few feet away. Elias listened without interrupting, his hands clenched into fists on the table by the time she finished. "How long has this been going on? The affair?" "I don't know," Sophia admitted. "He wouldn't tell me at the hospital. He just kept saying it wasn't what it looked like." "It's always what it looks like," Elias said grimly. "Men only say that when they're caught." Over the following days, small pieces of information began arriving from unexpected places, the way truth often does once the first crack in a lie appears. A former assistant of Daniel's, a young woman named Priya, who had left the company several months earlier, under circumstances Sophia had never fully understood, reached out through a mutual friend. She said she had something Sophia needed to see, and she was tired of staying silent. They met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, away from anywhere Daniel or his colleagues might recognize her. Priya arrived nervous, glancing over her shoulder twice before sitting down, and she wasted no time once she did. "I left the company because of what I saw," Priya said, sliding her phone across the table. "I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." On the screen were messages, dozens of them, spanning over a year, exchanged between Daniel and Claire on a company messaging platform Priya had once had access to for administrative reasons. The messages started innocently enough, work-related, professional. But as the months passed, the tone shifted, grew warmer, more familiar, until finally there was no mistaking what the relationship had become. Sophia scrolled through slowly, her stomach tightening with every new message. There were dinners mentioned that had never been on Daniel's calendar at home. Hotel confirmations for the coastal trip he claimed was purely for work. A message from Claire, sent just 3 weeks before the fire, that made Sophia's blood run cold. It read simply, "When will you finally leave her? I'm tired of waiting." "There's more," Priya said quietly. "Financial records too, if you want them. I noticed some strange transfers when I was still handling his expense reports. Money going to an account that wasn't tied to any project I recognized." Sophia asked her to send everything she had. Priya agreed, though she made Sophia promise never to reveal where the information had come from, fearing retaliation from Daniel or his company. Sophia gave her word and meant it completely. That night, back at Elias's apartment, Sophia sat at the kitchen table long after her brother had gone to bed, scrolling through message after message on her laptop, piecing together a timeline that made her feel physically ill. The affair had begun over a year earlier, shortly after Daniel's promotion to senior director. Claire had joined his team around the same time, and within a few months, their late nights at the office had stopped being about work entirely. There were shell accounts too, exactly as Priya had mentioned, small transfers disguised as consulting fees that had, over the past year, added up to a significant sum. Money quietly funneled toward an apartment Claire had been renting closer to the office, an apartment Sophia had never known existed. By the time the sun rose, Sophia had not slept at all, but something inside her had hardened into resolve. She was no longer the woman crawling through smoke, desperate and afraid. She was building something now, carefully, methodically, and she intended to make sure that when the truth finally came out, there would be no way for Daniel to talk his way around it. Daniel called again that morning, and this time Sophia answered. "Sophia, thank God," he said, his voice tight with relief. "Please, can we talk? Can you at least tell me where you're staying?" "I know about Claire," Sophia said, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. "I know about the apartment. I know about the money." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Daniel finally spoke again, his voice had changed entirely, the pleading tone replaced by something colder, more careful. "Whatever you think you know, it's more complicated than that." "Is it?" Sophia said flatly. "Because it seems fairly simple to me. You've been paying for another woman's apartment with money that should have gone toward our daughter, while telling me you were working late." "I never meant for any of this to hurt you," Daniel said. "You carried her out of a burning house before you even looked for me," Sophia said, her voice finally cracking despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I don't think you get to talk about not meaning to hurt me anymore." She ended the call before he could respond, her hands trembling as she set the phone down on the table. Elias, who had been standing quietly in the kitchen doorway, walked over and wrapped his arms around her without a word, letting her cry against his shoulder for the first time since the fire. Over the next week, Sophia met twice more with the divorce attorney Elias had recommended, a sharp and composed woman named Grace, who specialized in cases involving hidden assets and financial misconduct. Grace reviewed the messages, the financial records, and the account transfers with a calm, focused expression that Sophia found strangely comforting. "This is a strong position," Grace said during their second meeting, tapping a pen against the folder of evidence spread across her desk. "The affair alone would matter for the settlement, but the misused company funds change everything. If he was funneling money meant for legitimate business use into an account supporting his mistress, that's not just a marital issue. That's something his board of directors, and possibly his investors, will want to know about." Sophia had not considered that angle before, but the moment Grace said it, something clicked into place. Daniel's reputation, his career, his entire identity was built around the image of a disciplined, trustworthy executive. If the affair became public on its own, he might weather the storm, spin a story about a marriage under strain, garner some sympathy even. But if it came out that he had misused company funds to support that affair, there would be no spin clever enough to save him. "I don't want to rush this," Sophia said carefully. "I want to be smart about it. I want to make sure that when this comes out, there's no way for him to twist it into something sympathetic for himself." Grace nodded approvingly. "Then we build the case quietly first. We gather everything. Bank statements, messages, witness accounts if we can get them formally documented. And when we're ready, we choose the moment and the method that gives you the most leverage, not just legally, but in every sense." Sophia left that meeting with a folder of her own now, carefully organized, growing thicker by the week. She had transformed from a woman lying on a hospital bed, betrayed and helpless, into someone actively shaping the outcome of her own future. It did not erase the pain of what had happened. The image of Daniel's silhouette moving past her in the smoke still returned to her some nights in dreams she could not control. But alongside that pain, now sat something new, something powerful. Purpose. She began attending doctor's appointments alone, refusing Daniel's requests to accompany her, and found a strange peace in those quiet waiting rooms, just her and the steady heartbeat of her daughter on the monitor, a reminder of exactly what she was fighting to protect. Daniel continued to reach out, his messages alternating between apology and increasingly thinly veiled frustration that she would not simply forgive him and move forward as though nothing had happened. Meanwhile, according to a source Grace maintained inside Daniel's company, tensions were rising on his end as well. Claire, apparently emboldened rather than chastened by the events of the fire, had begun pressing Daniel more openly, tired of secrecy, wanting him to finally leave Sophia and make their relationship public. The very thing that had once been carefully hidden was now becoming harder for Daniel to control, cracks appearing on every side of the life he had built. Sophia learned to feel almost nothing when she heard these updates, treating them as pieces of information rather than fresh wounds. She was no longer the woman waiting anxiously by the phone for Daniel's explanation. She was building something, patiently and precisely, and she intended to make sure that when it was finished, There would be no question left unanswered, no lie left standing. Late one evening, sitting in the nursery Elias had helped her set up in the spare room, arranging tiny clothes in a drawer for a daughter who had not yet arrived, Sophia allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. She rested her hand against her belly, feeling the familiar kick and shift beneath her palm, and spoke quietly into the empty room. "I promise you," she whispered, "no one will ever leave you behind, not while I'm still breathing." Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the quiet war being assembled one document at a time in a modest apartment across town. Daniel had no idea how much Sophia already knew, how far she had already come from the woman crawling through smoke just weeks earlier. He believed, in the arrogant way people often believe when they have not yet faced real consequences, that this would blow over in time, that Sophia would eventually calm down and return to the life he had built for them. He had no idea that the woman he left behind on the stairs was no longer waiting to be rescued. She was preparing to burn his world down the same way he had nearly let hers burn, except this time, everyone would be watching, and there would be nowhere left for him to run. 3 weeks after the fire, Sophia sat across from Grace in a small conference room, a folder between them thick enough now to require a rubber band to hold it closed. Bank statements, screenshots of messages, notarized copies of Priya's account, and a growing list of names willing to speak quietly about what they had witnessed at the company over the past year. "We have enough for a strong settlement already," Grace said, flipping through the final pages. "But you mentioned wanting more than that. You want this handled a certain way." Sophia nodded slowly. "I don't want a quiet settlement where he gets to keep his reputation and his career intact, while I disappear into some private agreement. I want people to know exactly who he is, not out of revenge. Because if he does this to me, he'll do it to someone else, and because he used company money to fund it, his investors deserve to know as well." Grace studied her for a long moment, then nodded with something like respect. "Then we need the right moment. Something public enough that he can't spin it, but controlled enough that you stay protected throughout. I have an idea, but it depends on timing." The idea centered on an upcoming shareholder event, a large gathering scheduled for the following month, where Daniel, as senior director overseeing several major accounts, would be presenting quarterly results alongside the company's board. It was exactly the kind of event where reputation mattered most, where investors and press would be watching closely, and where any hint of scandal would carry maximum weight. "If we present the evidence there," Grace explained, "in front of the board, with press already gathered outside for the event, there's no room for him to control the narrative afterward. It becomes a matter of public record before he even has a chance to prepare a response." Sophia felt a flicker of something sharp and satisfying at the thought, quickly followed by a wave of exhaustion at how far she had traveled from the woman who once trusted her husband without question. But there was no turning back now, and more than that, she did not want to turn back. Her daughter would be born in a matter of weeks, and Sophia was determined that she would enter a world where her mother had stood up and told the truth, rather than one where she had quietly accepted a lie. In the weeks that followed, Sophia lived 2 separate lives at once. On the surface, she maintained a calm and distant politeness with Daniel whenever necessary, exchanging brief messages about logistics, insurance paperwork for the destroyed house, medical appointments he still occasionally asked to attend. She kept her tone even, gave nothing away, let him believe that perhaps she was slowly softening, slowly moving toward reconciliation. Beneath that surface, she worked closely with Grace, and a forensic accountant Grace had brought onto the case, a meticulous man named Peter, who specialized in tracing exactly how money moved through corporate accounts. Peter spent hours combing through the financial records Priya had provided, cross-referencing them with public filings from Daniel's company, building a clear and undeniable picture of exactly how much money had been diverted, when, and where it had ultimately ended up. "It's worse than what you initially found," Peter told Sophia during one of their meetings, sliding a printed report across the table. "This isn't just a few consulting fees here and there. Over the past 14 months, more than $200,000 has moved through accounts connected to Claire, disguised as marketing and outreach expenses that never actually happened." Sophia stared at the number, feeling something cold settle in her chest. It was not just betrayal anymore. It was theft, dressed up in corporate language, hidden behind spreadsheets and invoices that had fooled an entire accounting department for over a year. "Will this hold up?" she asked, "if we present it publicly?" "It's solid," Peter said. "I've cross-checked everything 3 times. Any competent forensic review would reach the same conclusion I have." Meanwhile, according to updates from her source inside the company, tensions between Daniel and Claire had grown increasingly strained. Claire, apparently unaware of how closely Sophia was watching, had begun making her frustration known more openly among co-workers, complaining that Daniel kept promising to leave his wife and never followed through. She had grown careless, no longer bothering to hide her presence at company events where Daniel was also expected to attend, drawing quiet whispers among colleagues who had once assumed the affair was merely office gossip. Sophia felt no satisfaction hearing about Claire's frustration. If anything, it reminded her of a version of herself from years earlier, a woman who had once trusted Daniel's promises completely, who had once believed that his words meant something. She almost pitied Claire, almost, before remembering the message Priya had shown her. "When will you finally leave her? I'm tired of waiting," written while Sophia herself sat pregnant and unknowing in the very house Claire wanted her removed from. Pity had its limits. As the shareholder event drew closer, Grace arranged a final meeting to walk through exactly how the day would unfold. They would arrive separately, blending into the crowd of press and shareholders gathering outside the venue before the event began. Grace had already reached out quietly to 2 trusted journalists, known for careful, fact-based reporting, providing them with enough advance information to ensure they would be present and prepared, though without revealing every detail until the moment itself. "Once the evidence is presented to the board privately," Grace explained, "the press outside will already be aware something significant is happening inside. We control the pace from there. This isn't about creating chaos for its own sake. It's about making sure the truth comes out cleanly, all at once, in a way he cannot twist or minimize." Sophia listened carefully, memorizing every detail of the plan, running through it in her mind late at night when sleep would not come. She thought often of the night of the fire, of crawling through smoke while Daniel carried another woman to safety first. She thought of the hospital bed, of Daniel's evasive answers, of the cold clarity that had settled over her in that room as she realized exactly what kind of man she had married. She was no longer that frightened, betrayed woman. She had become something steadier, sharper, more deliberate, and she intended to use every bit of that steadiness on the day the truth finally came out. 2 days before the shareholder event, Sophia went into early labor. It began quietly, a tightening across her lower back that she initially dismissed as ordinary discomfort, the kind she had experienced on and off throughout the final weeks of her pregnancy. But by evening, the tightening had become rhythmic, undeniable, and Elias drove her to the hospital with white knuckles on the steering wheel, glancing at her every few seconds as though she might disappear if he looked away too long. Labor stretched through the night and into the following morning, exhausting and painful in ways Sophia had never fully prepared herself for, despite months of reading and preparation. But somewhere in the final hours, gripping Elias's hand as he stood in for the partner who should have been there and was not, Sophia found a strange clarity amid the pain, a reminder of exactly why she had fought so hard over the past month to protect what mattered most. Her daughter was born just after sunrise, small and furious and perfectly healthy, her cry filling the delivery room with a sound Sophia would remember for the rest of her life. She named her Rosalind, a name with no connection to Daniel, no connection to the life that had burned down weeks earlier, a name that belonged entirely and only to the 2 of them. Daniel arrived at the hospital hours later, having heard the news through a mutual acquaintance rather than from Sophia herself. He stood awkwardly at the doorway of her room, staring at the small bundle in Sophia's arms with an expression that flickered briefly between wonder and shame. "Can I hold her?" he asked quietly. Sophia studied him for a long moment before answering. Whatever else he had done, whatever else he would face in the coming days, this was still his daughter, and Sophia did not believe in punishing a child for her father's failures. She nodded slowly and allowed him to hold Rosalind for a few careful minutes, watching his face soften in a way she had not seen in weeks. But softness did not undo betrayal, and when the moment passed, when Daniel handed Rosalind back and asked, almost hopefully, Whether this meant they might find their way back to each other, Sophia shook her head firmly. "This changes what I'm fighting for," she said, "not whether I'm fighting." Daniel left the hospital that afternoon, looking more shaken than she had seen him since the night of the fire, though she could not tell whether it was grief over the marriage or simple fear of what still awaited him. She suspected, given everything she now knew about him, that it was likely the second. The shareholder event, originally scheduled for that same week, was postponed briefly due to unrelated logistical issues within the company, giving Sophia an unexpected window of time to recover before the confrontation she had spent weeks preparing for. She used those days to rest, to hold her daughter close, to let Elias and a small circle of trusted friends surround her with the kind of support she had not realized she needed so desperately. But even in those quiet, healing days, the folder Grace kept locked in her office continued to grow, one final piece of evidence added just before the rescheduled event, a piece that would prove, in the end, to be the most damaging of all. A recorded conversation, obtained legally through a colleague willing to testify, in which Daniel discussed with Claire exactly how he planned to eventually push Sophia out of both the marriage and the company's shared family trust, using language that made his intentions unmistakably clear. Grace called Sophia the evening the recording arrived, her voice carrying a rare note of genuine anger. "He wasn't just having an affair, Sophia. He was actively planning to cut you and your daughter out entirely. This isn't a man who made a mistake in a moment of weakness. This is calculated." Sophia sat quietly on the edge of her bed, Rosalind sleeping peacefully in the bassinet beside her, and felt the last small fragment of doubt she had been carrying, some quiet hope that perhaps Daniel truly had simply panicked that night, finally disappear entirely. "When is the rescheduled event?" she asked. "Next Thursday," Grace said. "Are you ready?" Sophia looked down at her sleeping daughter, at the small hands curled peacefully against the blanket, and felt the last of her hesitation settle into something firm and unshakable. "I've been ready since the night he left me on those stairs," she said quietly. "Let's finish this." The morning of the shareholder event, Sophia dressed carefully in a dark blue suit Grace had helped her choose weeks earlier, something professional and composed, nothing that could be dismissed as emotional or dramatic. Rosalind, barely 2 weeks old, stayed home with a trusted friend of Elias's, a retired nurse who had offered to help without hesitation once she heard even a fraction of the story. Grace met Sophia in a car, 2 blocks from the venue, running through the plan one final time. "The board meeting starts at 9. We'll be let in through a side entrance around 9:30, after opening remarks, but before the financial presentation, which is when Daniel is scheduled to speak. Peter will already be inside with printed copies of the report. The 2 journalists I mentioned will be positioned outside, aware something significant may happen, but without specific details." Sophia nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap, steadier than she expected to feel given the weight of what was about to happen. "And if he tries to deny everything in the room?" "He won't be able to," Grace said simply. "The evidence speaks for itself. All you need to do is stay calm and let it unfold." The venue was a sleek glass building downtown, the kind of place designed to project success and stability, banners already hung in the lobby announcing the company's strong quarterly performance. Sophia walked through the doors feeling strangely calm, as though she had stepped outside her own body and was watching herself move toward a conclusion that had felt inevitable since the night of the fire. They were escorted quietly to a private boardroom on the 4th floor, where the company's board members had gathered ahead of the main event downstairs, reviewing final numbers before the public presentation began. Daniel stood near the front of the room, adjusting his tie, running through notes on a tablet, entirely unaware of what was about to happen. He looked up when the door opened, his expression shifting rapidly from professional composure to visible shock as he registered Sophia standing there, Grace beside her, Peter following close behind with a stack of folders. "Sophia," he said, his voice tight, "what are you doing here?" The board chairman, an older man named Harold, with sharp eyes and little patience for surprises, looked between them with obvious confusion. "Daniel, do you know these people?" "This is my wife," Daniel said carefully, clearly trying to control the situation before it spiraled further. "I'm not sure what this is about, but perhaps we should discuss it privately. I don't think privately is appropriate anymore, Sophia said, her voice calm and clear, carrying easily across the quiet room. Not after what I've learned over the past month. Grace stepped forward smoothly, addressing the board directly, with the kind of confident professionalism that immediately commanded attention. My name is Grace Whitfield, and I represent Sophia in matters concerning her marriage to Daniel. I understand this is an unconventional interruption, but what we have to share directly concerns the financial integrity of this company, and I believe the board has both a right and a responsibility to hear it before this morning's presentation proceeds. Harold's expression shifted from confusion to wary attention. You have 5 minutes, he said. This had better be significant. Peter distributed folders around the table, each containing a clear summary of the financial evidence, the diverted funds, the shell accounts, the disguised expense report spanning 14 months. Grace walked the board through it methodically, her voice steady and precise, avoiding emotional language entirely, letting the numbers and documentation speak for themselves. Daniel's face grew pale as the presentation continued, his earlier composure cracking visibly with each new piece of evidence laid out before the board. This is a misunderstanding, he said, his voice rising slightly. Those transfers were legitimate consulting arrangements. With an employee you were simultaneously engaged in a romantic relationship with, Grace said calmly, using funds that were never approved through proper channels and were disguised in your quarterly reports as marketing outreach expenses. We have documentation showing otherwise, including a recorded conversation in which you discuss these arrangements in detail. The room fell into a heavy silence. Harold, along with several other board members, flipped slowly through the pages in front of them, their expressions darkening with each line they read. One board member, a sharp-featured woman named Diane who oversaw financial compliance, looked up first, her voice cutting through the quiet. Daniel, is this accurate? Did you divert company funds to support a personal relationship? Daniel opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, glancing helplessly around the room as though searching for an escape that did not exist. The silence stretched long enough to answer the question on its own. I want to be clear, Sophia said quietly, stepping forward for the first time since entering the room. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because 3 weeks ago, my husband carried his mistress out of a burning house and left me behind on the stairs, 8 months pregnant, calling his name. I nearly lost consciousness from smoke inhalation. Our daughter, born just 2 weeks ago, could have been lost that night because he chose someone else first. And when I started asking questions afterward, I discovered that this affair had been funded, in part, using money that belonged to this company and to every person sitting at this table. Several board members exchanged glances, visibly disturbed. Harold set down the folder in his hands and looked directly at Daniel. Is any of this untrue? Daniel said nothing. I think that answers the question sufficiently, Harold said grimly. He turned to an assistant near the door. Cancel the morning presentation. We need to convene privately, immediately, without Daniel present. 2 security personnel appeared at the door moments later, escorting Daniel out of the boardroom with quiet efficiency, his protests growing increasingly desperate as he was led away. Sophia watched him go, feeling something complicated settle in her chest, not quite satisfaction, not quite grief, but something closer to relief that the truth had finally, undeniably surfaced. Outside the building, exactly as Grace had arranged, the 2 journalists were waiting, along with a growing cluster of press who had gathered for the originally scheduled shareholder event and now sensed that something far more significant was unfolding inside. Grace handled the initial statement carefully, providing a measured, factual account without unnecessary embellishment, allowing the documentation to carry the weight of the story rather than dramatic language. By early afternoon, the story had spread rapidly across financial news outlets, the headline focusing primarily on the diverted company funds, though details of the affair and the fire soon followed, adding a human element that made the story impossible to ignore. Daniel's name, once synonymous with disciplined success within his industry, was now attached to words like fraud and misconduct in headline after headline. Claire's reaction, when it came, arrived swiftly and without hesitation. According to updates Sophia received through Grace's contacts within the company, Claire had resigned by that same evening, releasing a brief statement claiming she had been misled about the nature of the financial arrangements and had no knowledge that company funds were involved. Whether or not this was entirely true, Sophia had no way of knowing, and found she cared very little either way. What mattered was that Claire had made her choice clear the moment the story broke, distancing herself entirely from Daniel, offering no support, no loyalty, nothing but swift and self-protective silence. Daniel called Sophia that evening, his voice raw and desperate in a way she had never heard from him before. "You destroyed everything," he said. "My career, my reputation, everything I built. You destroyed it," Sophia said quietly. "The night you carried her out first. Everything after that was simply the truth catching up to you." "I could still fight this," he said, though his voice carried little conviction. "The board hasn't made a final decision yet." "They will," Sophia said. "And even if they didn't, it wouldn't change what happened between us. I'm not doing this to punish you, Daniel. I'm doing this because our daughter deserves a mother who stood up for herself when it mattered, instead of one who quietly accepted being left behind." She ended the call and set the phone down, looking across the small living room at Elias's apartment, where Rosalind slept peacefully in her bassinet, entirely unaware of the storm that had unfolded that day on her behalf. Sophia walked over and gently touched her daughter's tiny hand, feeling the small fingers curl instinctively around hers. 3 days later, the board announced Daniel's immediate termination, along with a public statement confirming an internal investigation into the misused funds and a commitment to full transparency with shareholders moving forward. Legal proceedings regarding the missing money began shortly after. Separate entirely from the divorce proceedings, Grace was now finalizing on Sophia's behalf. Daniel's world, so carefully constructed over years of ambition and careful image management, had collapsed within the span of a single week, the same speed with which the fire had once consumed the home they shared. Sophia felt no particular joy watching it happen, but she felt something perhaps more valuable than joy. She felt, for the first time since the night of the fire, that the truth had finally been allowed to stand fully in the light, with nowhere left to hide. Grace called that same evening, with news of the divorce settlement negotiations, her voice carrying quiet satisfaction. "Given everything that's come out, his legal team isn't in a position to fight for much. We're looking at a significant settlement in your favor, full custody, and a share of assets that reflects everything he tried to hide." Sophia thanked her, then sat quietly for a long moment after the call ended, looking down at her sleeping daughter, feeling the weight of the past month finally begin to lift from her shoulders. The house was gone, the marriage was gone, but something new had begun to take shape in its place. Something built entirely on her own strength, her own choices, her own refusal to be left behind ever again. The fire that had nearly taken everything from her had, in the end, revealed exactly what needed to burn away. 6 months passed, and the city Sophia once knew as the backdrop to her marriage had become, quietly and steadily, the setting for an entirely different life. She had moved into a small townhouse, not far from Elias, bright and simple, with a nursery painted a soft yellow that Rosalind had already begun to associate with the comforting rhythm of bedtime stories and morning light streaming through the window. The divorce had finalized 2 months earlier, the settlement exactly as strong as Grace had predicted. Sophia walked away with full custody of Rosalind, a substantial share of the assets Daniel had once controlled, and something Grace had fought hard to secure, a portion of the family trust that Daniel had once quietly planned to remove her from entirely. There was a certain quiet justice in that detail, one that Sophia thought about often in the early weeks after the settlement was signed. Daniel, for his part, had largely disappeared from the public eye. The criminal investigation into the misused funds had resulted in a plea agreement, sparing him a lengthy trial but leaving him with restitution payments that would take years to complete, along with a permanent mark on his professional record that made any return to his former industry nearly impossible. Sophia heard occasionally, through mutual acquaintances who still crossed paths with him, that he had taken a much smaller role at a company 2 states away, working quietly, keeping a low profile, a shadow of the ambitious executive he had once been. Claire had vanished from Sophia's awareness almost entirely after her resignation, and Sophia found she rarely thought of her at all anymore. Whatever role Claire had played in the collapse of the marriage, Sophia had come to understand. Over months of reflection and the occasional session with a grief counselor Grace had recommended, that the deeper betrayal had never truly been about Claire specifically. It had been about Daniel's choices, made again and again, long before that night in the smoke. The counselor, a warm and patient woman named Margaret, had helped Sophia work through not just the anger, but the quieter grief beneath it. The mourning of a marriage she had once believed in completely, the mourning of the version of herself who had trusted so easily. It's possible, Margaret told her during one of their sessions, to grieve what you lost while still being grateful for what it revealed about your own strength. Those two things aren't in conflict. Sophia had carried that thought with her in the months since, letting it settle into something she believed, rather than simply understood intellectually. Professionally, her life had transformed in ways she never could have anticipated, during those long nights crawling through smoke, or lying awake reviewing financial documents with Grace and Peter. The forensic accountant, impressed by Sophia's sharp instincts and her calm, methodical approach throughout the entire process, had offered her a position at his firm shortly after the divorce settled, initially in an administrative role, but quickly expanding as her genuine aptitude for the work became apparent. Within a few months, Sophia found herself studying for certification exams in forensic accounting, staying up late after Rosalind had gone to sleep, textbooks spread across the same kitchen table where she had once pieced together the evidence that unraveled Daniel's entire life. There was something quietly poetic about it, she thought, building a career from the very skills that had allowed her to protect herself and her daughter when it mattered most. "You have a gift for this," Peter told her one afternoon, reviewing a report she had prepared for a smaller client case. "Most people miss the small inconsistencies. You never do." "I had good practice," Sophia said simply, and Peter, who knew her story well by then, only nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Elias remained a steady presence throughout those months, showing up for Sunday dinners, helping with Rosalind whenever Sophia needed an extra set of hands, gradually easing back into the role of protective older brother without the constant undertone of worry that had defined the early weeks after the fire. He often told Sophia how proud he was of her, though she noticed he rarely said it directly, choosing instead to show it through small, consistent gestures, fixing a leaking faucet in her new townhouse, showing up unannounced with groceries on particularly exhausting weeks, sitting with Rosalind for hours so Sophia could study in peace. Sophia's relationship with her own reflection had changed as well, something she noticed gradually, rather than all at once. In the early days after the fire, she had avoided mirrors, uncomfortable with the exhausted, hollow-eyed woman staring back at her. But somewhere in the months of rebuilding, that discomfort had faded, replaced by something steadier. She recognized herself again, though it was a version of herself she had never quite met before the fire, someone sharper, more deliberate, less willing to accept comfortable lies simply because they were easier than difficult truths. Rosalind grew quickly, as babies do, her personality beginning to emerge in small, delightful ways. She had her mother's stubborn determination, evident even in infancy, through the fierce way she gripped anything placed near her tiny hands, refusing to let go until she was entirely ready. Sophia found herself laughing more in those months than she had in the year leading up to the fire, genuine laughter, unburdened by the quiet unease she had spent so long ignoring in her marriage, without fully realizing it. On the one-year anniversary of the fire, Sophia stood in the kitchen of her townhouse, Rosalind babbling happily in her high chair nearby, and found herself thinking back to that night with a clarity that no longer carried the same sharp pain it once had. She remembered the smoke, the panic, the sight of Daniel's silhouette moving past her on the stairs. She remembered lying on the lawn afterward, watching him tend to another woman while she gasped for air a few feet away. It no longer felt like the defining wound of her life. It felt, instead, like the beginning of something else entirely, the moment everything false in her life had finally been forced into the light, giving her the chance to build something honest in its place. Grace called that same week, with an update Sophia had been quietly anticipating. The company where Daniel once worked had finalized a broader review of their financial oversight practices, implementing new safeguards specifically designed to prevent the kind of misconduct that had occurred under Daniel's direction. In a strange twist Sophia had not expected, the company reached out through Grace, offering Sophia a consulting role helping review their updated compliance procedures, given her first-hand understanding of exactly how such schemes could go undetected for so long. Sophia accepted the offer, walking into that same glass building downtown for the first time since the day she had exposed Daniel in front of the board, though this time as a professional in her own right, invited for her expertise, rather than arriving to confront a betrayal. Harold, the board chairman who had once listened gravely as Grace laid out the evidence against Daniel, greeted her personally in the lobby. "We're grateful you agreed to help," he said, shaking her hand warmly. "It says a great deal about your character, given everything that happened here. I don't hold the building responsible for what one person chose to do inside it," Sophia said, "and I'd rather see it done right going forward than simply walk away." The consulting work expanded steadily over the following months, eventually leading Sophia to open a small, independent practice of her own, specializing in exactly the kind of financial oversight and fraud detection that had once saved her from being erased entirely from her own family's assets. She hired Priya, the former assistant whose courage in coming forward had started the entire process of uncovering the truth, as her first employee, grateful for the chance to repay, even in a small way, the risk Priya had taken on her behalf. On a quiet evening nearly a year and a half after the fire, Sophia sat in her new office downtown, a modest but polished space with her name on the door, reviewing the final details of a case for a client who had come to her in circumstances not unlike her own, a woman beginning to suspect financial dishonesty from a partner she had once trusted completely. Sophia listened to her carefully, recognizing pieces of her own story in the woman's nervous, uncertain voice. "How did you know where to even start looking?" the woman asked. Sophia thought for a moment before answering, remembering the hospital bed, the folder growing thicker on Grace's desk, the boardroom where the truth had finally been forced into the light. "You start by trusting what you already know, even when it's painful," she said. "And then you build, carefully, piece by piece, until no one can talk you out of what you've seen with your own eyes." The woman nodded slowly, something steadying in her expression, the same quiet resolve Sophia recognized from the woman she had once been forced to become. Later that evening, Sophia picked up Rosalind from Elias's apartment, her daughter now walking confidently, chattering happily in the half-formed words of early toddlerhood, reaching up with both arms the moment she saw her mother's face. Sophia lifted her easily, settling her onto one hip, feeling the familiar warmth and weight that had, more than any courtroom victory or professional success, become the true center of her rebuilt life. Driving home through streets lit gently by the last light of evening, Sophia glanced in the rearview mirror at her daughter, already drifting toward sleep in her car seat, safe and entirely unaware of how close she had once come to being left behind on a smoke-filled staircase, in a house that no longer existed. Sophia thought of Daniel occasionally still, not with anger anymore, but with a distant, almost clinical understanding of who he had been and who he likely remained. She hoped, in some quiet corner of herself, that he had found whatever peace was available to him after everything unraveled. But she no longer needed anything from him, no explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of the choice he had made in those critical seconds during the fire. She had built her own peace instead, brick by brick, document by document, choice by choice, in the months following the worst night of her life. She had walked into a boardroom as the woman left behind, and walked out as someone entirely new, someone who understood, finally and completely, that her own strength had never depended on being rescued by anyone else. The fire had taken her home, her marriage, and the comfortable illusions she had once mistaken for happiness. But it had given her, in exchange, a clarity and a resilience she would carry for the rest of her life, along with a daughter who would grow up knowing, without ever needing to be told directly, exactly what her mother had been willing to fight for. Sophia pulled into the driveway of her townhouse, the porch light glowing warmly in the early evening dusk, and carried her sleeping daughter inside, closing the door quietly behind them on a life finally, completely her own.